The New Testament on papyrus is extant in large numbers. We have around 100, well, the list goes up to 122. That's the latest list of early material on papyrus, reflecting portions, at least, of the New Testament writings. I mean, in this list of 120 or so New Testament manuscripts on papyrus, some of them are very fragmentary, absolutely tiny pieces, about this big. Others, in a sense, we do have substantial collections. We certainly have collections of Paul's letters, very important Chester Beatty manuscript from about 200, which has a whole collection of Paul's letters. So, in a sense, we do have substantial material on papyrus from very early time, but around that, and as well as that, we have a great number of, in a sense, single sheets that are all that remains of what once was a bigger book. Sometimes even have pagination, so we know this was page 84, for example, of a large thing. So even though we only have a small bit of evidence now, we know that it did reflect a bigger thing. The smallest of all is only about 1 inch by 1 inch, a small piece of Romans from the 3rd century. But we still, in a sense, can learn from this small fragment and calculate how big the page was and then how big, in a sense, Romans was in this format. So as well as the really substantial pieces, which are the fundamental pieces, the small fragments also do help us in our knowledge of the text of the New Testament. In the early period, we do have, in a sense, a lot of evidence for both Matthew and John. So for Matthew in total, there's around 24 or so of the papyrus fragments of bits of Matthew. From the earliest period, say 2nd and 3rd century, we have around 12 or so. We have about 13 or 14 pieces of John from this same kind of time period, 2nd and 3rd century. And clearly they were the very popular Gospels, apostolic Gospels. The evidence for Mark and Luke is still there, but is much less. So Luke, we know from 4 very early material. In a sense, they're quite substantial text of Luke, but not in great numbers. And Mark, in a sense, is the odd one out. He's the one we have the least evidence for. We have an early 3rd century text with Mark, and the other 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, as I mentioned before. And then we have material from the 4th century onwards. The John Rylands fragment of John, a bit of John 18, which New Testament scholars know as P52, is almost certainly our earliest extant piece of a New Testament document and a written story of Jesus. As I said, from John 18. It's certainly from the first half of the 2nd century.
We believe the fragment was found at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, which is famous for the papyri that have been discovered there. We don't know exactly where it came from or the date that it was discovered, because proper records weren't kept. But it was probably at the beginning of the 20th century, and it came to the library more or less by accident in 1920. It was part of a large collection of papyri that we purchased in 1920. And it was only in the mid-30s, when the scholars were cataloguing the archive, that this particular fragment was identified and dated. So we certainly didn't know what we were buying at the time. The fragment was dated on paleographical grounds, in other words, by studying the handwriting and comparing it with other datable examples. We're often asked whether it's been radiocarbon dated, and it hasn't, because that's a destructive process. You need to take a portion of a fragment and destroy it in the dating process. So obviously we don't want to do that. And no one has ever questioned the reliability of the dating evidence, so there doesn't seem to be any point in subjecting it to a destructive test.
Dating these materials is pretty tricky, because none of them are written down with a date. The first manuscript of any sort with a date is in the 5th century. The first Bible manuscript with an actual date is in the 8th century, 8th or 9th century. So we date them by comparison with other documents, some of which are dated. If you write a letter to somebody, that's a dated, they can easily be dated documents. So the process of dating something like this fragment, again, without even all the alphabet in that sheet is pretty complex. Initially, people dated this very early in the 2nd century, or possibly in the 1st century. There's a text written in the reign of Domitian from 96 onwards that is very close in style to P52. There's also, in a sense, later documents from the middle of the 2nd century that are quite close as well. So there's nothing really conclusive as to how we date it. That's why we say, in a sense, early 2nd century. So the technique is difficult and complex. I mean, it does give good results. Generally, throughout the period from the 1st century to the 5th century, when it's been tested, dating by handwriting is as accurate as carbon-14 testing when it has been tested. But it can't give you precision. This was written in 123 on August the 12th or anything like that. We just don't have that information at all.
We're talking about a date of round about 125, give or take 20 years. We can't be too precise. And this makes it probably the earliest surviving piece of a New Testament in the world. It's written on both sides, which indicates that this is a leaf from a book. And the passage is where Christ is questioned by Pontius Pilate just before the crucifixion. Pilate asks Jesus what is truth, and we actually have the Greek word aletheia on the reverse of the fragment. The fragment is hugely important for our understanding of the composition and spread of the New Testament, and particularly of John's Gospel at a comparatively early date. Prior to its discovery, it was believed that John's Gospel was written later in the 2nd century AD, significantly later than the other Gospels. This discovery pushed back the dating to the late 1st century AD. Obviously, we don't have John's original. People often wonder whether this particular fragment was written by John himself, and of course it wasn't. It's dated maybe 30 or 40 years after the Gospel was first composed, but it's as close as we will get to that original text.
P66 is a fantastically preserved text of John's Gospel. Certainly the first 14 chapters, just completely, but absolutely wonderful. Whole pages, not much, doubt about anything. The last 6 chapters are a bit more fragmentary. That's been a bit more damaged in the collection. And there's a bit of a process of putting the pieces back together. This is a fantastic manuscript, P66, one of our best manuscripts of John. Very early. Interesting debates about the date of this, because some very respectable scholars put it as early as 150. Most people would go around 200, and some have put it a little later, slightly into the 3rd century. We have another manuscript we know as P64, which is a piece of Matthew's Gospel, which is now housed in Oxford in Magdalen College Library. There's another piece of the same thing, which is P67, which is in Spain, in Barcelona. And they're clearly part of the same document, same text of Matthew's Gospel, which is a very well-written text, 2 columns, well-presented, perhaps quite a readable sort of text of Matthew, from around the end of the 2nd century, around 200. Again, the dates are not certain at all. P75 is another one of the Bodmer collection. This is a whole text of Luke and John bound together. I've been missing the first couple of chapters of Luke and the last couple of chapters of John. But it's a very early text of both those Gospels, fundamentally important for our knowledge of Luke in the late 2nd century, around 200. And an exceptionally good text. This scribe was exceptionally careful, had access to the best, purest sort of text. P88, it's a 4th century text of Mark. It's held in Milan. It's got an exceptionally good text of Mark, very clear, and very close, textually speaking, to our major unsealed texts of Mark from around the same time. It's comparatively rare for being Mark. We have slightly less evidence for Mark than the other Gospels. And this is a 4th century text. It's a very good text. Again, it's a text that's fully in line with our major, uncial codices of Mark. P45, this is one of the Chester Beatty manuscripts discovered in the late 20s, early 30s, 1920s, 1930s. This is a manuscript which has material from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. Probably actually in the order Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, and the book of Acts. P45 is one of our best bits of evidence for, increasingly a collection of material from different documents into one text. Quite a complicated text, and it also shows lots of interesting things, like at some point somebody has been reading out from this in a church meeting, and he's added great sort of marks to punctuate his reading, and sometimes to highlight odd words, foreign words and things like that, difficult words, bits of strange geography that the reader didn't know yet. This P45, where we customarily date sometime around the middle of the 3rd century. It's got a lovely hand, very compact. It's crowding a lot of material on each page. But we do have some comparable material that we can be fairly confident within the range. It's certainly within the range of between 200 and 300. So the P45 is one of our best manuscripts for all these things together: Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, the book of Acts.